MPs are due to vote today on whether to cancel or set in motion the long-planned Leveson 2 inquiry into the press and social media. In March, the Culture Secretary Matt Hancock announced the second phase was being ditched, but in response, the former Labour leader, Ed Miliband, tabled an amendment to the Data Protection Bill to establish a new inquiry into the media. So, do we need Leveson Part 2? Joining me to discuss this are the former Liberal Democrat MP and Joint Executive Director of the campaign group, Evan Harris, and Jodie Ginsberg, who's Chief Executive of the Free Speech Defenders Index on Censorship. Welcome to you both.
Hacked off campaign is what you meant to say. We're also free speech defenders.
Did I not say hacked off campaign?
No, you said the campaign group Evan Harris.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Which is a great,
Well, all right. Thank you for that correction.
It's got a personality cult.
Thank you for that correction. We'll put it on the front page. Now, Evan Harris, why do we need more? Why do we need Leveson 2? I mean, the government simply says things have moved on.
Yes, well, they could say that about any public inquiry. Things have moved on from Grenfell, things moved on from the Stephen Lawrence matter. What we know is that since Leveson Part 1, when only one rogue reporter or one rogue newspaper was involved, it now turns out that the Trinity Mirror Group have admitted to hacking thousands of people over 10 years across 3 titles. We read, not in the newspapers, but in investigative journalism websites, of the sort that I'm sure Index is aware, that The Sun have stood accused in court of blagging the medical records of terrorism victims and dead children, and the Sunday Times was reported on the BBC and even in The Guardian that someone said that for 15 years they'd been hacking into the bank accounts and utility bills of politicians and ordinary people, their families and associates. None of that was revealed at Leveson Part 1. In fact, Leveson was misled, in my view, at Part 1, and he says, the judge himself says, it's wrong that this should be covered up. And I don't know of any newspaper in the Western world in the past 50 years, and I've looked, that's ever called for the abandonment of an inquiry into criminal wrongdoing, corruption and cover-up. As you know from Watergate, it's not so much the criminality, it's the cover-up. And I can't find a single example of an NGO, a free speech NGO, saying we don't want sunlight to disinfect this, we want to cover it up, we want to cancel a public inquiry. Final point, if it's any other industry, quite rightly our newspapers would be saying there must be a public inquiry into the banks, into the police, into politicians, quite right. Only when it's their own industry do they and their acolytes say, we don't want this, let's cover it up, let's renege on our promises to victims.
Let's talk about the issue rather than other inquiries, because I think, for example, the Stephen Lawrence family have said nothing will be served by a further inquiry. But
into the Stephen Lawrence family, there was an inquiry,
I don't think the newspapers necessarily are supporting the idea of the inquiries into historic sex abuse. So, I mean, but that's irrelevant. The argument's made there, a lot of wrongdoing, and Evan Harris thinks there should be an inquiry. Why shouldn't there be?
We don't think there needs to be a second inquiry. We think the first inquiry was useful, but actually resulted in very few convictions. And as the government has said, time has moved on. This inquiry, Evan is wrong to say, would only focus on the press. The new inquiry rightly recognises that the industry has moved on an incredibly long way since then. We get much of our news not necessarily just from the newspapers, but from social media, from news platforms. And this inquiry would be so far-reaching and so enormous and of such financial cost and perhaps never-ending length that I don't believe it would bring any sunlight at all. I think it would just bring confusion and deliver none of the vital things that we actually need as a democracy, which is a free and vibrant press investigating the corrupt and the powerful. And a far more concern to us, actually,
what if the corrupt and the powerful are the
Evan,
press?
you spoke for a long time. You can let me finish. I gave you...
I just wanted to ask you, what if the corrupt are the press?
What if the corrupt are the press? Then we have to hold them to account. But that's why we have a regulatory system. But what I wanted to say was far more worrying for us are the financial penalties that are also being proposed under this
suggestion that you should be liable for
bill.
the cost whether you win or not. And
absolutely. And I think that's much more worrying for us as a press freedom organisation, because I don't think that's of any benefit whatsoever to us as ordinary people, as citizens who rely on a free, vibrant, independent, troublesome media in order to bring us the information that otherwise big business, the corrupt politicians would want to conceal.
I believe in that sort of media as well, and what these other amendments do is say that if people feel their rights have been impinged. At the moment, there's no regulation of newspapers because they have their own self-regulatory
Well, there is
system.
regulation.
There is regulation of
IPSO
newspapers,
exists,
though.
doesn't it?
Yes, so
And it
the
appears to be
Leveson
working.
inquiry, which Jodie said she supported, at least in part, said that the Press Complaints Commission and the IPSO model, which is the press marking their own homework, no investigations, 0 in 4 years, no fines, 0 fines in 4 years, no arbitrations in the 2 years they've had the opportunity, and not a single equal prominence front page correction.
Well, actually,
so there is
that's not
effectively
true.
no...
Last week, the Times had a full front page correction.
Right, you'll have to correct that because it was a tiny thing at the bottom.
It was on the front page. You said not a single front page correction.
I said equal prominence front page correction. If you put something tiny at the bottom, having said Muslim girl forced adoption, which turned out to be false, then you should have equal prominence. But my point is that the way the system works is that if you are a member of a recognised regulator, a fair one, that offers low-cost arbitration...
It's funded by Max Mosley.
Anyone can fund it.
Impress is funded by Max Mosley, isn't it? Well, that's the only one that's been recognised by the government.
What the Leveson said is newspapers form your own. Okay? If you offer low-cost arbitration, then you as a newspaper, if someone decides to take you to court, they will have to pay your costs. And that's a real boon to small investigative journalism outlets who've joined Impress and would join another one.
But the flip side is, let me just explain the flip side. Offers low-cost arbitration.
It doesn't offer low-cost arbitration.
It does offer low-cost
arbitration. No, it's not compulsory, it's not universal, it's not fair. But the point is that if you don't offer that, if a newspaper says we're not going to be independently regulated and we're not going to offer approved low-cost regulation, you must go to court, ordinary person, then Leveson said in that case they should pay the cost.
Not necessarily ordinary person, could be an institution, couldn't it? Could be a very rich company.
So if someone says, if you and I want to go to Bolton and I say I can afford to go by bus,
but I'm just
and you say I want a limousine,
you're saying ordinary
then
person,
you pay for the limousine, mate.
But likewise, if you are a powerful corporation, you can expect the newspapers to refund your money under these rules.
And the simple answer to any libel bullying is simply to join an approved regulator. That's why Article 19, the premier free speech organisation, and the National Union of Journalists support both these amendments.
All right. Why doesn't it work?
We don't believe that anyone should be forced to join a regulator, and certainly not one that has state backing. We wouldn't join Impress. We are a publisher of a news publication.
We are Sky News, BBC News, ITV News. We're all regulated by statute. Why shouldn't the newspapers?
The newspapers should be regulated. Leveson said that there should be self-regulation. Self-regulation can work and works in many instances. It's an absolutely historic break with 300 years of British tradition to have any kind of state involvement in the regulation of the press. And we do not believe that a state-approved... we should be forced to join a state-approved regulator.
What about his argument you'd have protections if you join these regulators?
We would have protections if we joined Impress. At the current moment, we wouldn't have protections, obviously, if we joined IPSO, because it has not sought recognition. We wouldn't join either IPSO or Impress. We believe that we should be able to regulate ourselves and have a code of conduct that holds us to the highest standards, and that people should be able to be...
On a point of fact, Impress and a recognised regulator is not state-approved. Okay. The body that approves is independently, like judges, appointed.
We're going to have to leave it there, and we're going to have to see how MPs vote this evening. Indeed. Full coverage of that here on Sky News. That's All Out Politics for today. Coming up, more on Iran.